At 2:17 a.m., the little girl's heart monitor flatlined. 11 miles away, her dog, locked in a steel cage, bolted upright and unleashed a howl so haunting it silenced the entire shelter. No one could explain the timing, but what they discovered afterward will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. There are two kinds of silence in a hospital at night. The first is passive, the hush of sleeping patients, the soft whir of machines, the distant shuffle of shoes on polished floors. It's the silence you expect, the kind woven from routine and exhaustion. But then there's the other kind, the silence that presses against the walls like something alive, like something that knows what's coming before you do. That was the silence in room 407 at St. Bridget Memorial Hospital at 2:12 a.m. on a Thursday morning. Julia Carson sat beside her daughter's bed, gripping the frayed sleeve of her hoodie like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the room. Her body was still. Not relaxed, never that, but frozen by a kind of learned fear, the kind that tightens with every passing minute. She hadn't slept in almost 40 hours. Her eyes were bloodshot, but dry. They'd stopped producing tears 2 days ago. Now they only stared. On the bed, Emily, just 8 years old, lay motionless under thin blue sheets. A nasal cannula pushed oxygen into her body. 3 IV lines fed into her arms. Her chest rose and fell with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. Machines monitored everything: heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, each screen glowing faintly in the darkness like tiny, indifferent gods. But Julia wasn't watching the machines. She was watching Emily's left hand. Not because she expected it to move, but because she needed it to. In her lap, Julia held a plastic bag from the shelter. Inside was a chewed blue rubber bone, a collar with worn stitching, and a folded Polaroid photo of Emily and her dog Murphy, taken last summer. Emily had drawn little hearts on the white border with red marker. The caption she'd written underneath, in proud, looping letters, read, "Murphy is my shadow and best friend. Even if I go away, he'll find me." Julia didn't want to read that again, but her fingers kept unfolding the photo over and over, as if doing so might reverse time. Murphy wasn't here. He was locked in a municipal kennel 11 miles away, under fluorescent lights and behind cold steel bars. Dogs weren't allowed in the ICU. Julia had begged once, then again, then stopped asking, after the nurse said it would only upset the other families. And now Emily was barely a family anymore. The clock on the wall ticked to 2:14 a.m. The heart monitor beeped steady. O2 at 97%. Respiration consistent. Julia leaned forward and brushed Emily's hair back gently. Her hand trembled at the touch of her daughter's skin, so smooth but cold, not freezing, not yet, just too still. She whispered, "I'm still here, baby. I'm not leaving." Silence. And then, the monitor chirped. Julia's head snapped toward the screen. Heart rate, 130, 138, 147. Oxygen saturation dropped to 94%, then 89%, then 76%. A flurry of numbers collapsed in real time. Julia jumped up and hit the call button. Lights blazed. The door burst open. Nurses came in fast. Marcia, the night nurse, followed by Daniel, a young tech intern. Behind them, Dr. Kumar, called in from the cardiac unit, already pulling gloves on. "What happened?" Marcia asked, reaching for the monitor cable. She just started crashing. I don't know, She flatlined," Daniel muttered, staring at the screen. "No," Julia breathed. No, do something." They started CPR. Julia was pulled out of the way. She backed into the corner of the room, gripping the wall, eyes wide, hyperventilating as the scene unfolded. 30 compressions. Charge the paddles. No rhythm. Again. And above it all, Julia heard something she couldn't place. A sound, far away, but unmistakable. A howl. Long. Deep. Ragged. It wasn't coming from inside the hospital. It couldn't be. But she heard it, cutting through the sterile air like a thread of grief that had no place in this world. She looked around. No one else reacted. Maybe it was in her head. Maybe she was already breaking. 217, Dr. Kumar said, quiet, like he didn't want the words to exist. Call it. No. Julia shook her head violently. No. Call what? Call what? I'm sorry. Julia sank to her knees. Her nails dug into the linoleum. She screamed once. Raw, animal, brutal, then went utterly silent. Her mouth opened again, but no sound came out. Only her shoulders moved, racked with sobs that her body had no strength left to express. On the monitor, a flat line pulsed steady and cruel. The machines were still running, but nothing inside the room was alive anymore. No one told her, because no one knew yet, that across town a shelter worker had just logged a strange line in their nightly report. 0217, Shepherd Mix, ID 2487, began prolonged howling with no external trigger. Behavior persisted for 55 minutes. Unusual severity noted. No one would connect the dots, not that night, but when they did, it would unravel something deeper than coincidence. Because that sound Julia heard, the one no one else acknowledged, wasn't imagined. It was Murphy. And he knew. Julia Carson hadn't spoken at the funeral. She sat in the front pew, pale and motionless, with her hands folded around a crumpled photograph of Emily and Murphy, one she'd found in a kitchen drawer, the edges warped with time and grape juice. The chapel was filled with the quiet murmurs of people who didn't know what to say, who offered casserole dishes and condolences like they were life jackets in a storm already long gone. But inside Julia, something hadn't settled. Not like it should have. It was the time. 2:17 a.m. She couldn't stop seeing that number. It wasn't the hour itself that disturbed her. It was the way it coincided. The memory clawed its way back every time she closed her eyes. Emily's monitor crashing, the scream that never left her mouth, and most of all, that howl. She'd heard it. She was certain of it now. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't trauma warping her senses. There had been something inhuman outside that hospital room when her daughter's life ended. Something primal and aching. And there was only one being on earth who had ever made that sound in her presence. Murphy. Julia wasn't the kind of woman to believe in signs. She believed in procedure, in policy, in rules and consequences. She worked in billing for a construction firm and had audited 6 departments into compliance without ever raising her voice. She did not see omens in bird feathers or the shape of spilled milk. But now she couldn't stop replaying the question. Why would a dog howl like that at that exact moment? If he didn't know something. She didn't even remember driving to the Brookhaven Animal Shelter. The funeral had ended hours ago, and she'd changed into jeans and a hoodie, but her hands still trembled on the steering wheel as if the coffin had just lowered into the ground. She pulled into the gravel lot and sat there for 5 full minutes, watching the chain-link fences sway in the wind, listening to the low, distant barking that never really stopped. Inside, the front desk was manned by a young intern with acne scars and earbuds looped around his neck. He barely looked up from his clipboard. "Pickup?" he asked. Julia nodded. "Name of the animal?" "Murphy. Shepherd Mix. He was dropped off 10 days ago. He belonged to my daughter." The boy nodded, typed a few keys, squinted at the screen. "Yeah. ID number 2487. Cage 17A. He stood, grabbed a clipboard, and gestured for her to follow. The back hallway was dim and smelled like bleach that had lost a war with urine. Dogs barked louder here, raw, hoarse barks, some excited, some terrified. But none of them sounded like Murphy. When the intern opened the cage, the shepherd didn't lunge or bark. He just looked at her. His ribs were visible. His water bowl was overturned. There was dried food caked into the floor. But none of that registered, not yet. Because Murphy recognized her instantly. His ears perked. His eyes locked onto hers. And then he took one hesitant step forward, stopped, then collapsed onto the concrete floor in a slow, deliberate bow. Not a playful bow, a submission, deep and mournful. His whole body shook, not from cold, but something deeper. Julia knelt down without thinking and reached for his collar, and Murphy whined, a low, broken sound that pushed something sharp into her chest. "What the hell happened to him?" she asked, eyes still on the dog. The intern shifted uncomfortably. "He's been off since the night of the 12th. Her stomach tightened. "That was the night Emily." The boy nodded, awkward now. "Yeah. Weird thing. Started howling out of nowhere. Wouldn't stop. Freaked out half the other dogs." "What time?" He blinked. I don't know. Early? Like 2:30? Julia stood. "Do you log behavior?" He shrugged. "We write incident notes for weird stuff, yeah." "I want to see the log." "I don't think I'm supposed to." "Then get someone who is." 5 minutes later, she was alone in the cramped front office, flipping through a spiral-bound binder with plastic sleeves. Most entries were routine: fights over food, medical flags, escape attempts. Then she saw it. 2:17 a.m. Dog in 17A began prolonged howling without stimulus. No provocation. Vocalization abnormal in pitch and duration. Sedation administered at 03:12. Logged by A.M. Murphy. 2:17. Julia reread the line 3 times. She didn't cry. Her grief had no tears left. It had calcified into something brittle and cold. Something that felt a lot like certainty. This wasn't random. This wasn't just a dog howling at the moon. He had felt her go. She looked up. "Do you keep security footage?" "Not for long," the intern mumbled. "Overwrites every 72 hours. Why?" Julia didn't answer. Her brain was already moving faster than her mouth could keep up. It was Tuesday. Emily died early Thursday morning. That gave her less than 2 days to get her hands on that footage before it vanished forever. She walked out the door without saying another word, Murphy at her side, limping. The next 46 hours would become a race against silence, and she would not let her daughter's final connection to this world be overwritten by policy. The email arrived at 3:42 a.m. No subject, no text, just a download link, encrypted. Julia had been awake for 37 hours by then, cycling through espresso, old voicemail recordings of Emily's laughter, and the worn scent of Murphy's collar clutched in her lap like a relic. When her phone buzzed, her pulse spiked. She tapped the screen. A prompt flashed. "Download video file. BKSH KAMM5s 0212 03122 AVI. Brookhaven Shelter. Camera 5." The night her daughter died. She didn't wonder who sent it. Maybe it was the intern. Maybe it was someone else entirely. It didn't matter. All that mattered was the timestamp. Julia's hand trembled as she loaded the file onto her laptop and hit play. The footage was static gray for several seconds, then resolved into the shelter's indoor kennel row, a narrow concrete hallway with metal bars on either side. The date in the corner read 0212. Rows of dogs lay curled in shadows. A distant fluorescent flickered on and off like a pulse about to flatline. One camera, one continuous shot. No sound. Julia fast-forwarded to 2:10 a.m. She watched Murphy. He was asleep in the center of his cage, head down, chest rising slowly. His body was still, save for a twitch in one paw. REM sleep. Then, at 2:17:01, something changed. Murphy's body convulsed once, not violently, but like a jolt had passed through him. He jolted upright with a sharpness that almost made Julia flinch. His ears stiffened. His head turned, not toward the gate or food bowl, but toward nothing, an empty wall. He sniffed the air, once, twice, then slowly backed toward the far edge of the cage, and then he howled. There was no audio, but Julia could feel it through the screen. His throat stretched wide, his jaw trembled, and his whole ribcage heaved with effort. This wasn't barking. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, a sound dragged up from marrow. She froze the frame. Murphy's eyes were locked forward, unblinking. His body vibrated from tension. Other dogs began stirring in their cages behind him, heads rising, tails between legs, reacting to something they couldn't see. He didn't stop. For 55 minutes he howled intermittently, rising, collapsing, rising again. The rest of the kennel descended into chaos. At one point, a pit bull in the far corner barked himself hoarse, while another dog cowered under its bed, urinating in fear. One snapped its teeth through the bars at nothing. Julia pressed pause. She leaned back slowly, heart pounding in her ears. It was like watching a crime scene unfold, but instead of blood, there was a kind of spiritual residue, some terrible frequency echoing just beneath what the camera could capture. And yet, she felt it. She knew that howl. It was the same sound she'd heard from room 407. Not a copy. Not something similar. Identical. And now, watching Murphy's body convulse on screen, she knew with icy certainty he had felt it. The second Emily left this world he had known. She closed the laptop and sat perfectly still in the dark. Her thoughts came fast now, sharp, surgical. She needed to confirm the timing. Julia drove to St. Bridget Memorial at 7:15 a.m., just as the night staff handed over to the day shift. The ER was busy, but she moved through it with the aim of a woman who no longer feared embarrassment or resistance. Marcia, the night nurse, was still at the main desk, rubbing at the deep purple bags under her eyes. "You were there the night Emily passed," Julia said. Marcia looked up. "Yes, I remember. I'm so sorry. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." Marcia straightened. "Of course. Do you remember hearing anything strange that night? A sound? Like howling?" Marcia didn't speak for a moment. Then her eyes narrowed. "You heard it too." Julia stepped closer. "So it wasn't just me. I told Dr. Kumar. He said it must have been wind outside the vents. But I remember..." Marcia swallowed. "It was right around when the machines went crazy. A long, low howl, like a siren made of sorrow. And you've never heard anything like it before." "Not in my 20 years here." Marcia looked down. "We joked after that maybe something came for her, something that knew before we did." Julia pulled out her phone, opened the log she'd photographed at the shelter. "Murphy, Emily's dog. He started howling at 2:17 a.m. Marcia stared. "That's the time we recorded as the moment of death." "Exactly." A silence settled between them, this time not the sterile kind. It had weight. Julia closed her phone and breathed out slowly. The suspicion that had coiled inside her was no longer just a feeling. It had structure, a shape. Something had passed through both places that night. It had no name, no form, but it had a signature. 217. She thanked Marcia and left, moving like someone walking underwater, deliberate, slow but focused. Later, as she drove home, Murphy's head rested on her lap in the passenger seat. For the first time since she'd gotten him back, his breathing had calmed. His body was still tense, but no longer shaking. He'd done his part. Now it was her turn. Because somewhere, somehow, Emily had spoken. Through a picture, through a howl, through the impossible timing of a bond deeper than language. And Julia wasn't done listening. It wasn't until 3 days later that Julia touched the collar. It had sat, untouched, on the corner of her kitchen table like something radioactive. Murphy had brought it back with him from the shelter, still buckled around his neck, but she hadn't dared remove it. Not out of laziness or grief, out of fear. Fear that doing so would finalize something, like unclipping it would declare to the universe, "She's really gone. It's over." But it wasn't over. Not when every hour since the funeral had been crawling with signs too exact to dismiss. Not when her daughter had whispered a dog's name from coma silence. Not when that same dog had howled with grief the very second she died. So Julia stood now, in the living room, with Murphy sitting in front of her, obedient, silent, still marked by something that had altered him. His eyes had always been soft, playful, almost comic in their expressiveness. Now they looked older, watchful, like something had looked through him and hadn't quite let go. "Good boy," she whispered. Her fingers moved with hesitation, not from fear of the dog, but fear of what memory might be stitched into this thing. She unclasped the buckle. The collar slacked. As she lifted it from his neck, Murphy gave no reaction. No flinch, no whimper. He simply stood and walked to the couch, curling tightly into the corner like he'd done when Emily was sick, like some phantom imprint told him to be near. Julia turned the collar in her hand. It was ordinary. Leather with frayed edges, a rusted metal tag engraved with his name and her old cell number. But something scratched her finger, a ridge under the inside seam. She flipped the collar inside out. There, taped to the underside of the leather lining, was a folded piece of paper, no larger than a chewing gum wrapper. Yellowed slightly at the edges, as though it had been there for weeks. Her heart started hammering. She peeled it away with trembling fingers and carefully unfolded the creased square, and froze. The handwriting was unmistakable. She had stared at it on birthday cards, refrigerator notes, doodles pressed into the corners of homework assignments. It was Emily's. Blue marker, letters a little crooked with the R's always too big, spelling imperfect, but real. "If I forget everything, if I get scared, just send him. He'll find me. Love you, Mommy." Julia sat down, hard. She didn't cry, not right away. The moment felt too big for tears. The air around her seemed to press in, thick with something reverent, sacred, like the atmosphere of a church right before someone confesses the one thing they've never told another soul. She read the note again. "If I forget everything." The line hit her like a cracked rib. Emily had written this before the coma, before the hospital. But how much before? Julia tried to remember. Had they changed Murphy's collar recently? Had Emily been alone with him in the days leading up to her collapse? She combed through her memory like a forensic sweep, and something came into focus. 2 weeks before Emily had fainted in class, she'd spent an entire afternoon in the backyard with Murphy, drawing pictures, talking to him. Then, quietly, she'd come back inside and asked Julia, "Can dogs go where people can't?" "What do you mean?" Julia had asked. "I mean, like if someone's too scared to go alone, would a dog go for them?" At the time, Julia had laughed. "Murphy would follow you into space if he could." Now, the question returned like a ghost. Emily hadn't meant it as a metaphor. She'd known. Somehow, that fragile, intuitive little girl had felt it coming, felt the veil between this world and whatever lay behind it starting to thin. She had known she might forget, might lose herself, might drift somewhere cold and unreachable. So she had planted a message, a tether, and she had given it to him. Julia pressed the note to her chest, closed her eyes, and exhaled. This was no coincidence. This was intention. It wasn't about superstition or grief-fueled hallucination. It was about connection. Something older than science, older than language, buried deep in the marrow of mammals that had hunted and slept beside each other for millennia. Murphy had heard her daughters leaving. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. And now, with this note in her hand, Julia knew the truth. Emily hadn't been alone when she died. Her body had gone quiet, yes. Her brain had shut down. But somewhere, someplace her mother couldn't follow, Emily had been scared. And Murphy, locked in a cage miles away, had howled into that darkness. Not because she was gone, because he'd found her. Julia didn't know where this left her, what it meant about life or death, or what the soul was really made of. But as she looked down at the note again, one thought rang so clear it left no room for doubt. He kept his promise.